Agentic AI has been around for like a good 6 to 9 months. So naturally, it's time for us to have a new term and something else to all buzz about. But don't worry, Salesforce is here and they have created a new term that they're calling EGI or Enterprise Generalized Intelligence. And they are striving to make Agentforce that solution just for you. And the way that they're going to do it is through synthetic data. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Leading Change. My name is Emma Roloff, and in these episodes of Change in the Wild, I take a look at technology current events and how they relate back to the world of digital transformation, change management, leadership, and emerging technologies. And today, we're going to talk a little bit about the idea of synthetic data powering our AI models. And it all starts with a recent headline that came out about Salesforce, specifically trying to get their Agentforce solution to take this role of enterprise generalized intelligence, which they are defining as business optimized AI capable of delivering reliable performance across complex business scenarios while maintaining seamless integration with existing systems, which to me kind of sounds like what agentic AI was supposed to do, but I digress. I guess they're still calling it an agent. They're just going to coin it as EGI to make it sound a little bit more exciting. If you're enjoying our content, consider subscribing to our channel, giving this video a like, and dropping a comment. We personally respond to every comment that we get because we enjoy having a conversation with you. So this all comes from the idea that they feel like their model is a little too jagged. And in order for it to be able to truly operate in the human-like scenarios that they need to, they needed to introduce a new training environment in order to allow smoothing of some of these jagged edges that they're seeing with their agentic model. And they released what they are calling Everse, which is on their journey towards this enterprise general intelligence. Essentially, it is a training environment for companies to use prior to go live with synthetic data to be able to get their agentic AI solution operating at a high enough value that they can trust it. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of synthetic data. What is it? How is it being used? What are the scenarios where it makes sense? And maybe what some of the risks are associated with it.
You want to fill me in on that?
So first and foremost, synthetic data is exactly what it sounds like. It's data that is being created outside of real life experiences in order to train AI models. And oftentimes we rely really heavily on it when we look at industries like healthcare, where there's things like HIPAA compliance or other heavy regulatory components that we need to kind of like go up against. Oftentimes, people will also cite synthetic data as a way for us to potentially remove bias that might be in place in historical data. And then also, it's a cost saving metric. So oftentimes getting your hands on massive amounts of data can be pretty expensive. And when you've hit your limit of what data is available or the amount of money that you have to obtain said data, synthetic data becomes another option for these companies to continue to grow their models and continue to hopefully improve their performance over time. Now, there's some really interesting conversations out there about the role of synthetic data and if it ultimately is going to be what leads to the collapse of AI. So especially in the generative AI world, a lot of people will talk about the risks associated with generative AI as making it dumber. So when the entire internet is filled with resources that are created by humans, and we use those human resources to train our AI model to predict the way that a human would respond or create in the patterns in which this model has been trained on people responding and people writing and people engaging in these dynamics with real live data, it's able to start to mimic the humans more and more. But now what we're starting to see is that the synthetic data is going beyond just these specific test environments these companies might be creating. And the synthetic data or the generative AI output is starting to proliferate all over the place online. And these models are now starting to be trained on what these models created.
Come again.
Or specifically being fed synthetic data in order to grow the data set that they have access to. And you start to kind of set into this loop that a lot of people are saying is going to be the ultimate demise of AI. Because if it's not being trained on true data and human outputs, and it's only being trained on what was meant to mimic, how long can it continue to mimic that original human output or be able to learn from true human data if all it's getting is this synthetic or made up information?
Well, that's a good question.
And so one of the biggest things that needs to happen when we're looking at kind of trying to balance out the role of synthetic data and what it does to these models is making sure that there is a presence of both synthetic data and real data. One of the areas that we see a lot of this type of training happening is in insurance or healthcare when they are trying to do things like fraud detection. A lot of that comes down to the heavily compliant nature of those two industries and being able to get information to train these models without violating regulatory laws. One of the other use cases where we'll see a lot of synthetic data come in is things like self-driving cars. So example of Waymo, where they want to be able to test their AI model to be able to respond in really serious or dangerous scenarios, but they don't want to put a person or a vehicle in those situations. When we look at these places where there's high regulation or big risk associated with actually collecting the data, it definitely makes sense. But in these scenarios where Salesforce, for example, wants you to be able to more efficiently manage your customer service applications, does synthetic data start to create that loop where we potentially see this model collapse or your AI outputs decreasing in accuracy and reliability? Or in this scenario where maybe your synthetic data has some sort of bias that you're unaware of? Are you creating bias that didn't exist within the typical data and information? Or are you amplifying a bias that's already in place in historical data without realizing that you're doing that? And ultimately, when we look at bias increase or, really leaning into what might already be in historical data, or things like really this model collapse and making our AI dumber, we're not helping this trust component. And one of the things that Salesforce noted specifically is that their jagged model is 90 to 95% accurate, and that they aren't seeing the trust levels that they would like with their model. So the goal of this eVerse and using this synthetic data is to really hone in on these specific use cases and scenarios that the large language model hasn't done a great job of training it with, to increase the accuracy and increase the trust within the model. But the question that I have is, if we are using this synthetic data to train these models, are we actually increasing the trust within the model? Because we have all of these other areas of risk that we're opening up using synthetic data. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the use of synthetic data for training AI models as a whole, but also in this use case specifically with Salesforce, where they are trying to use this specialized synthetic environment to really hone in on the training of these models before deployment. And is that synthetic environment the right way to be honing in on these models before deployment? Or is that something that should be happening with the company's actual data in order to improve the outcomes within their specific environment? Chime in down below. I'd love to keep the conversation going after these episodes. So tell me your thoughts and I'll be sure to reply. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Leading Change. If you like what you saw, be sure to come back on a weekly basis and subscribe for more expert interviews focused on digital transformation, change management, and emerging technologies.